No one bets 600 million on a woman with no one waiting at home.
The numbers make the case.
Numbers don't build trust. People do. You have no one ite, no husband, no family. When this company bleeds, you walk clean. That's a liability.
She has someone. And who are you? Her husband. The waiter speaks for her.
Gavin Rourke didn't raise his voice. He didn't need to. In a room full of people with the power to decide Audrey Lennox's future, he simply enumerated what she lacked: a husband, a family, anyone who would stay when things became difficult. He delivered it the way men deliver things they consider already decided. He was right that the room heard every word. He was wrong about what those words would cost him. A man 3 feet away had already made a decision that Gavin Rourke would spend the next several months wishing he had anticipated. If you've ever rooted for someone to finally catch a break, stay with this one. And if stories like this are your thing, subscribing takes 1 second and helps us keep making them. Dorian Hayes had a rule about other people's problems; they weren't his. Not because he was cold, but because he had learned the way most men learn things that matter through loss rather than wisdom. That carrying too much of the world leaves nothing for the person who needs you most. He worked the dinner shift at Altura 5 nights a week, moved quietly between tables on the 46th floor of a Manhattan tower, and kept his expression professionally neutral regardless of what the people around him were saying or doing to each other. It was a skill he had developed long before the restaurant. The Army had a name for it. He just called it surviving. He had been a combat medic for 7 years, the kind of soldier other soldiers wanted nearby when everything went wrong. There had been a mission 7 years back that went wrong in ways no one was officially permitted to discuss, and the silence around it had followed him home. After he left the service, he came back to a city that didn't know what to do with him, and a daughter who needed him to figure things out fast. Leah was 5 when her mother died. She was 8 now, and Dorian had built their life around a single principle: she would never feel the ground shift beneath her feet, the way he had felt it shift under his. He took the night shift so he could walk her to school in the mornings. He told her they were doing fine, and he said it with enough steadiness that she believed it, which was its own kind of discipline. The night Audrey Lennox came into Altura, Dorian noticed her the way he noticed everything in that room, efficiently, without sentiment. She had reserved the private dining area on the east side, a table of 9, and she sat at the center of it with the careful posture of someone who had learned to take up exactly the right amount of space. Not too much, not too little. The kind of control that doesn't come from confidence so much as from years of being watched and measured by people who wanted her to fail. Audrey was the heir to Lennox Freight Systems, a logistics company her father had built from nothing, and which she had expanded considerably since his death, a fact the board of directors acknowledged in quarterly reports and quietly resented in every other context. They found her too young, too precise, and too unwilling to perform the kind of warmth that made powerful men feel comfortable. She had learned to work around them. The acquisition she was finalizing, a $600 million deal that would secure the company's position for a generation, was the argument she had been building toward for 3 years, and the dinner at Altura was the last obstacle between her and the votes she needed. Gavin Rourke had once been something closer to an ally. He had positioned himself as a partner during the early years of her leadership, had proposed a merger of their business interests, along with a marriage proposal that combined both ambitions into a single ask. When she declined, he had received it the way a man receives something he never genuinely believed could be refused, not with grief but with the particular cold recalculation of someone updating a plan. He had spent the 2 years since buying influence inside her board feeding stories to journalists and waiting for a moment that would let him finish what her refusal had started. One former associate of his, a legal advisor named Natalie Keene, had quietly left his organization that same year without signing the confidentiality agreement that typically followed such departures, a detail Audrey's research team had noted and filed without fully understanding its significance at the time. Gavin arrived at Altura 40 minutes into the dinner, which was 20 minutes after the wine had been opened, which meant someone had given him the timing. He chose a seat across from Audrey without asking, smiled at the investors, as though they were old friends, and began the process of dismantling her evening with the patience of someone who had planned it carefully and was in no hurry. He redirected every business point into a personal observation, let every joke land just close enough to professional to avoid objection, and ensured that by the time the main course arrived, the energy at the table had shifted from Audrey's numbers to Gavin's narrative. Then he said the thing that changed the temperature of the room entirely. He said it almost gently, as though raising a concern the others had been too polite to mention, that no one placed $600 million in the hands of a person with nothing to lose. No husband, no family, no one at home. When a company hits turbulence, he said what matters is whether the person steering it has anything anchoring them. Audrey had nothing like that. She would walk clean. That he suggested was a liability worth considering. Nobody spoke in her defense. Dorian was 2 tables away. He saw her hand on the linen napkin, the way her fingers had closed around it until the white of her knuckles showed. Her face was composed, her posture unchanged, but something in her stillness had shifted from control into endurance, and he recognized the difference because he had felt it himself. It was the stillness of a person absorbing a blow in front of an audience that is waiting to see if they fall. He thought about the months after his wife died when people told him he couldn't manage alone, and how not one of those people had offered to help him prove them wrong. I was not sure later that he made a decision in any deliberate sense. It felt more like stepping into a current that was already moving. He set down the bottle he was carrying, walked to the table, and said that she had someone. When Gavin asked who he was, Dorian looked at him directly and said that Audrey was his wife. The room went completely silent. Audrey turned to look at him. They had never met. He had never spoken to her before that sentence. But she understood within seconds what he had offered her, and she set her hand over his and told the table that they had kept the marriage private. A choice she stood by, and that she hoped Gavin would forgive the surprise. Her voice was even. The story held just long enough to shift the weight in the room, and the certainty Gavin had carried in with him developed a visible crack. The dinner ended without resolution in either direction. The investors hadn't committed, but they hadn't walked. Gavin left earlier than expected. When the table cleared, Audrey stayed behind and asked Dorian his name the way a person asks when they intend to remember it. He gave it to her and told her he didn't want money, didn't plan to extend the lie past that evening, and had simply been unable to watch someone face a firing squad alone while a full room studied the floor. She listened without interrupting. Then she gave him a card and told him to come to her office in the morning. He said he wouldn't. She said she would find him. He had not expected her to mean it literally. The next morning, Dorian was outside Leah's school at 11:45 the way he was every day. He saw the car before he recognized what it meant. Black expensive engine off, and Audrey Lennox was standing on the sidewalk in front of it looking at him. She handed him a tablet without greeting him first, and on the screen were 14 news articles carrying some variation of the same headline. A photograph had been taken at the restaurant. Someone had captured the moment Audrey's hand covered his. By 8 that morning, Lennox Freight's board had contacted her legal team demanding a marriage certificate within 48 hours. Gavin's lawyers had already begun requesting Dorian's personal records. Dorian told her to correct the record. He said it plainly. Audrey explained what that would mean an admission of fabricating a husband during an active deal negotiation would expose her to accusations of investor manipulation, dissolve the acquisition, and hand Gavin exactly the leverage he needed to remove her from the company her father had built. He wouldn't just win. He would take everything and dismantle the rest. He had assumed she would offer him a fee, a number, a contract, some arrangement with clean edges. Instead, she took a folder from the car and set it on the hood between them. Inside were marriage license application forms already partially filled out. She proposed they file legally that afternoon and maintain the arrangement for 90 days through the closing of the acquisition. After that, it would end quietly, and both of them would walk away without obligation to the other. He told her no. He said it without elaborating, because the reason was standing 30 feet away, backpack on, watching a pigeon with the focused attention of someone conducting original research. Leah looked up, saw him, and began crossing the sidewalk with her characteristic forward momentum. She stopped when she noticed Audrey standing beside him. She studied the woman for a moment, with the direct, uncomplicated assessment that only children and very tired adults are capable of, and then she said that the woman looked sad, even though her clothes were very nice. Audrey didn't answer immediately, not because she was calculating, but because no one had said something like that to her in a long time, and she was not practiced at receiving honest observation delivered without cruelty. It was that moment, not the legal argument or the business logic, that moved him. He saw the brief second before Audrey recovered her composure, and he recognized what was underneath it. She was not performing the difficulty of what she was asking. She was inside it. He agreed to 90 days, and he told her the only condition that mattered. She could build whatever story she needed for the rest of the world, but she would not lie to his daughter. Not about what they were not about. Why not about anything? Leah asked her directly. Audrey held his gaze and agreed without negotiating. That afternoon, the three of them went to a municipal office in Midtown. Dorian and Audrey signed the license in a small room with fluorescent lighting and a clerk who did not look up from her desk. Leah sat in a plastic chair against the wall and drew in the notebook she carried everywhere. On the ride home, she showed Dorian what she had drawn, the three of them walking through a door together. He folded it carefully and put it in his chest pocket. The lie he had told in a restaurant to save a stranger had become, before the day was out, precisely and legally true. He was not yet sure what that meant, but he understood, in the clear and practical way he understood most things that mattered, that the next 90 days were going to ask something of him that had nothing to do with paperwork. Audrey's apartment communicated its owner's priorities without any assistance. Everything in it was precise, expensive, and impersonal surfaces, uncluttered walls, bare the refrigerator stocked with exactly the kind of food a person keeps when they eat most meals at their desk or in cars between meetings. Leah walked through it the first evening, with her hands behind her back, the way she moved through museums, taking careful inventory. By the end of the second day, 3 drawings were held to the refrigerator door, with magnets Dorian had bought at a pharmacy on the corner. A sun. A shapeless dog. The 3 of them standing in front of a building. Audrey said nothing about the drawings, but she stopped opening the refrigerator without glancing at them first, and Dorian noticed that too. The arrangement found its shape over the first 2 weeks, in the practical, unglamorous way that most arrangements do, through scheduling adjustments and small negotiations, and the slow accumulation of knowledge about how another person occupies a shared space. Dorian kept the schedule he had always kept. Audrey began shifting her calendar in ways that were not announced, but were visible, as a dinner meeting moved to lunch, a call rescheduled, so she was back before Leah went to sleep. She didn't explain these changes. She simply made them, and the three of them ate together more evenings than not, which was more than any of them had planned for. Dorian attended the events required of him, learned the board members' names, understood the acquisition timeline well enough to answer questions without notes, and spoke to journalists in the direct, unornamented way that turned out to be more convincing than polish. The first serious test came at a charity gala 3 weeks in. Gavin was there, which Dorian had anticipated. What he hadn't anticipated was how quickly Gavin separated him from Audrey in the first 20 minutes, steering him to the edge of the room with the practiced ease of someone who had done this kind of thing before and enjoyed it. Gavin told him in a pleasant tone that he had obtained a copy of the marriage license. The date on it was the morning after the dinner at Altura, which created a documentable gap between the declaration and the legal reality. Gavin also knew about Dorian's financial circumstances, and he suggested that the distance between Dorian's situation and Audrey's told a story that didn't require much interpretation. He didn't use the word fraud. He didn't need to. Within 48 hours, that suggestion was in print. The story described Audrey as having recruited a man in financial difficulty to pose as her husband during a deal negotiation. It named Dorian. It referenced Leah, not with specifics, but enough. 2 photographers were outside the school by the next morning. Leah came home quieter than usual, skipped, showing him her drawing that evening, and when he sat down across from her and told her she could ask him anything, she looked at him for a long moment and asked whether he was keeping something from her. I was still working out how to answer when Audrey came through the front door. She had left the office early and had no one with her. She sat down at the kitchen table across from Leah and told her directly that the marriage had started in an unusual way. She didn't hide from it, but she also didn't dramatize it, and that people were now trying to use that unusual beginning to cause problems. Then she said the thing Dorian would return to many times afterward. She told Leah that her father hadn't made the choice he made because of money or position or anything that could be measured. He had made it because it was the kind of thing he was built to do, and that was not a quality that circumstances created in a person. It was either there or it wasn't. Leah listened with the serious attention. She gave things that mattered to her, then picked up her pencil and went back to drawing. It was as settled as any conversation between them was going to get, and it was enough. The board convened an emergency session 10 days later. Raymond Sutter, who chaired the governance committee, presented the marriage license date and asked Audrey whether the relationship had been constructed to influence investor sentiment during an active negotiation. 2 other members formally requested that she step back from the acquisition proceedings pending review. The room had the particular tension of people who had already decided and were waiting for the procedural cover to act. Audrey could have given them Dorian. The argument was available. A man acts impulsively. She responds under pressure. The marriage is a consequence she didn't engineer. It would not have saved her cleanly, but it would have divided the responsibility. She didn't take it. She told the room that Dorian's declaration had been made without prior agreement or any offer of compensation, and that the decision to file the license had been entirely hers. She accepted the full weight of it and declined to share it. Then Sutter turned to Dorian. The questions were not hostile in tone, which almost made them worse. Sutter asked what Dorian had been offered, whether a man of his income could reasonably be expected to act without material incentive, and whether his presence might be doing harm to a woman who was the board suspected not entirely aware of what she had walked into. Dorian let him finish. Then he stood and said he hadn't known Audrey's title, her net worth, or the size of the deal on the table when he walked to that table and said what he said. He had known only that a room full of people had gone silent, and she was absorbing the weight of it alone. He said he had told her she was his wife before she offered him a single thing, and that was the only credential he had come here with, and the only one he intended to offer. The vote to remove her didn't happen that afternoon. It was postponed pending review, which was not a victory, but was not a loss either. They rode back to the apartment separately. When they arrived, they didn't discuss the board meeting. That evening, Leah fell asleep on the sofa between them, while watching something she had chosen and lost interest in within 20 minutes. Audrey reached for the blanket on the armrest and covered her, smoothing the edge with a careful hand, the gesture of someone doing something unfamiliar that nonetheless felt correct. Dorian thought that was worth noting. Gavin's next move came from a direction Dorian should have anticipated, but hadn't fully prepared for. He had located an incident report from a mission 7 years earlier, in which 2 soldiers had died. The actual record read in full showed a command failure above Dorian's level, and showed Dorian re-entering a restricted area without authorization to reach wounded personnel who would otherwise not have been recovered. His silence about the chain of command failure had been a deliberate choice to spare the families of the men responsible from a public accounting that would have cost them something without giving them anything back. The version Gavin had prepared for publication removed every piece of that context, leaving only the violated order and the deaths. It was the same set of facts rearranged to mean something different, which is the particular kind of lie that's hardest to disprove because it contains enough truth to make the correction sound like an excuse. The ultimatum that followed was delivered through an intermediary. Dorian would sign a statement confirming Audrey had designed and directed the entire arrangement, accept full public responsibility, file for divorce, and leave the apartment. In exchange, the military story would not be published, and no complaint would be filed with the city's Child Protective Services, suggesting that Leah had been used as an instrument in a financial fraud. It was the Child Protective Services piece that landed. Gavin understood precisely what Dorian could absorb and what he couldn't. Audrey discovered the ultimatum before Dorian told her she had been monitoring Gavin's legal activity through channels she had established after the gala. She acted quickly and without telling him. She retained a family law specialist to make the custody question legally untouchable. She arranged a secure short-term residence for Dorian and Leah, and she drafted a statement in which she accepted full personal responsibility for the marriage arrangement, intending to deliver it at a press conference and end the acquisition herself. She had decided alone that losing the company was a price she could absorb. Losing Dorian's ability to keep his daughter was not. Dorian found out through Leah. Audrey had called him earlier that week to ask whether she could take Leah somewhere after school, a building with an interesting lobby. She said something she thought the girl would enjoy. He had said yes. It was only when Leah showed him the second apartment and asked with the directness of an 8-year-old who had been paying attention whether that was where they were going to live next, that he understood what Audrey had been doing. He found her in the study, with the documents spread across the desk. He told her with restraint that cost him something, that she had made decisions about his daughter's life, without telling him the full truth of what she was doing. She said she had been trying to protect his family, which was different from what he'd said. He told her that from where he was standing, it wasn't. She said she was running out of options that didn't cost someone something irreversible. He told her that walking away would cost Leah something she might not be able to name, but would carry the understanding that when things became genuinely hard, the people who had chosen each other left. Audrey didn't answer that directly. She opened the desk drawer and set the divorce paperwork in front of him, already signed, on her side. He looked at it. Through the kitchen doorway, Leah's 3 refrigerator drawings were just barely visible: the sun, the dog, the building. He thought about the night the articles ran when Leah had asked whether he was keeping something from her, and about how he had answered by saying she could ask him anything, which was not quite the same thing as answering. He picked up the paperwork, tore it in half, and set it back on the desk. He told Audrey that she had married a single father, and that carrying things alone was no longer available to either of them. Whatever Gavin had prepared, they would answer together, which meant full information, shared decisions, and no more unilateral moves dressed up as protection. She looked at him for a moment with an expression he hadn't seen before. Not relief. Something quieter and older than relief. Then she sat back down and told him everything she knew, and he told her everything he did. And they were still at the desk when Leah wandered in at midnight, looking for a glass of water, and found them there, which she accepted with the equanimity of a child who had decided some time ago that the adults in her life were going to be fine. The name Natalie Keene had appeared once in the background research Audrey had assembled on Gavin, a former legal advisor, who had left his organization without the standard confidentiality agreement that typically followed such departures. At the time, the detail had been filed without fully understanding its weight. It was Dorian who suggested they find her reasoning that a person who absorbed that kind of financial loss to exit a situation had a reason they were still carrying, and people who carry reasons tend to be willing to use them when the moment is right. Natalie met them in Brooklyn at a coffee shop well outside Midtown, which told Dorian what he needed to know about her comfort level with being visible. She was careful but not evasive, and what she confirmed was specific. Gavin had directed someone inside his organization to access Dorian's sealed military records through a contact inside a federal records office compensated for the service. She had been asked to review the materials before publication and assess legal exposure. She had resigned instead and kept copies of every communication that documented the request. Through her own attorney, she introduced them to a man named Owen Barrett, a former data administrator who had maintained the internal systems where those communications lived and who had preserved access logs and email threads as a form of personal insurance he had hoped never to need. The materials were precise and well documented. They showed the date the records were accessed, the name of the intermediary, the specific instructions to remove the sections of the incident report that placed Dorian's actions in their actual context, and a separate thread arranging for someone to photograph Leah outside her school on 2 separate occasions. The most important item was an email sent 3 days before the ultimatum reached Dorian, in which Gavin confirmed to a contact that the military story would run regardless of whether Dorian accepted the terms. The offer had never been real. It was a mechanism to add a signed confession to the demolition package before it went out. Dorian read that email twice. Then he set the tablet down and told Audrey's attorney to prepare the full submission for the district attorney's office and the relevant regulatory bodies. He asked how long it would take to assemble something that would hold up to scrutiny. The attorney said 72 hours. Dorian said to begin immediately. Then he called Gavin's intermediary and said he would meet Gavin at the hotel at the time originally proposed and that he would be coming alone. Audrey told him he didn't have to do it that way. He said he knew. She asked what he planned to do in that room. He told her he was planning to let Gavin finish. The suite was on the 32nd floor. Gavin was already there when Dorian arrived, jacket off, one button open, the posture of a man who had settled the outcome in his own mind before the conversation began. The materials were arranged on the low table. The statement. Dorian was meant to sign the divorce, filing a printed list of publication outlets with dates beside each one. That last item was a theatrical addition Dorian hadn't anticipated, but it told him something Gavin had been looking forward to this particular meeting for a while. He walked Dorian through it with the thoroughness of someone who had rehearsed it. The military story, the child services, filing the board vote already arranged for 48 hours after the statement went public. He explained what the statement would say, how it would be distributed, and what Dorian stood to lose by declining the custody question, the investigation, the way public accusation sticks to a person long after the underlying claim collapses. He said all of it in the tone of a man presenting options as though he were performing a professional courtesy. Dorian sat across from him and listened to the entire thing without speaking. He had learned in situations considerably more dangerous than this hotel suite that the most useful thing you can do while someone is talking is pay attention to what they're actually revealing, which is frequently not what they believe they're saying. What Gavin revealed over the course of 22 minutes was that this had never really been about a marriage license or a dinner at a restaurant. Audrey had been the target before Dorian existed in any version of the story. Everything since the restaurant had been aimed at completing something Gavin had set in motion long before Dorian walked to that table. When Gavin finished, he gestured at the statement on the table and said that Dorian should understand this wasn't personal. He had simply become a variable in a situation that required resolution. Dorian reached into the interior pocket of his jacket and set 3 items on the table in front of Gavin. The first was a bound summary of Owen Barrett's access logs with the relevant entries marked. The second was a printed copy of the email confirming the military story would run regardless of compliance with the date and recipient list highlighted. The third was a sworn and notarized statement from Natalie Keene attesting in full to the instructions she had received and the reason she had refused them. He told Gavin that Audrey's legal team had filed the complete package with the district attorney's office that morning. He also said that the board members who had been coordinating with Gavin, identified by name in the filings, had been notified separately, which gave each of them a narrow window to determine whether cooperation with investigators served their interests better than continued loyalty to a man whose private communications were now in the hands of prosecutors. Gavin looked at the materials on the table. Something shifted in his expression, not dramatically, not the way it would in a film, but in the small and specific way of a person recalculating what they thought they knew. He said after a moment that Dorian was someone who had stumbled into something he didn't fully understand, and that whatever he thought he had assembled wouldn't survive Gavin's legal team. Dorian told him that was possible. He also told him that he was Audrey's husband, that he was Leah's father, and that Gavin had made a foundational mistake in assuming that a man with a family to protect was more vulnerable than a man without one. In his experience, which included circumstances where the stakes were considerably more physical than a board vote, it worked the other way around. The agreement Gavin signed that afternoon, negotiated through his attorney over 4 hours, while Dorian sat in the lobby and read the news on his phone, required the withdrawal of all prepared media materials, the cessation of any contact with Lennox Freight board members outside official channels, and the full disclosure of every individual who had participated in obtaining and manipulating the sealed records. His attorney got the language softened in 3 places. It didn't change what it was. The military incident report was formally reviewed and declassified in full within 2 weeks, driven in part by the external pressure of the fraud investigation. The complete record showed what Dorian had known for 7 years, without saying that the deaths of the 2 soldiers had resulted from a command decision made above his level, that he had re-entered the restricted area without authorization because there were wounded personnel who would not otherwise have been reached, and that his silence in the years since had been a choice deliberate, considered, and made entirely for the benefit of people who hadn't earned it. The record showed a man who had protected others because that was what loyalty meant to him, not because he expected anything in return. Nobody formally apologized to him. He hadn't expected them to. Gavin's position within his own company became untenable as the board members who had been quietly supporting him recalculated their exposure. He stepped down from his seat and then from all affiliated positions. The business press covered it as a routine restructuring, which was the version of events everyone involved preferred. Natalie Keene cooperated fully with investigators. Owen Barrett received a letter confirming his assistance had been noted and that no further action would be taken regarding associated matters. The acquisition closed on a Thursday, 14 days after the hotel meeting. $600 million, the largest transaction in Lennox Freight's history, completed without a press event or a celebration dinner. Audrey signed the final documents at her desk and then sat there for a while without doing anything, which was something Dorian had never seen her do before. The 90-day window expired 4 days after the closing. Dorian packed their belongings that Saturday morning, starting with Leah's room and working through the shared spaces. Leah stood in her doorway and watched without offering to help, which was unlike her. He told her they had agreed to stay for 90 days, 90 days were done, and that honoring agreements was important. She said she knew in the tone children use when they recognize you're right and resent it. I was carrying the second bag to the entryway when Audrey came through the front door. She wasn't dressed for the office. She set her keys on the table by the door, walked past him to where Leah was standing in the hallway, and sat down on the floor in front of her. She told Leah that the marriage had started as something constructed. She used that word, not fake or pretend, because she was precise even when it cost her, and that she wouldn't ask Leah to pretend otherwise. She said the dinners had been real. The drawings on the refrigerator had been real. The particular feeling of waiting in the evenings for the sound of the two of them coming through the door had been real, and she had not expected it, and would not have predicted it, and did not know what to do with it, except say it out loud. She asked Leah whether she would be willing to let Audrey continue to be part of their lives, not as a role she was performing, but as a person who wanted to be there. Leah considered this with the seriousness she brought to things that mattered. Then she said Audrey was asking the wrong person, and that she should probably ask her dad. Audrey stood. She reached into her jacket pocket and took out the 90-day contract, the actual document, both signatures on it, and tore it in half along the fold. She set the pieces on the entryway table. Then she set a ring beside them. It was simple, a thin, plain band, nothing like the piece her publicist had selected for public appearances. She told Dorian she was no longer interested in employing a husband. She wanted to be a wife, not for a fixed term, not for a transaction, not for a board that needed reassurance. She wanted to come home to a place where he and Leah were. That was the thing she was asking for, and she understood if the answer was no, and she would not argue with it if it was, but she needed to ask it directly, because she had spent a long time building a life that required nothing from anyone, and this was the opposite of that. Dorian looked at her. Then he looked at Leah, who gave him a single nod with the gravity of someone casting a deciding vote. He told Audrey that the night at the restaurant had been the most impulsive thing he had done in his adult life, and that staying through the board sessions and the lawyers and the hotel suite, and the morning he tore up her paperwork had been the most deliberate. He told her those two things together felt like something worth continuing. He picked up the ring, held it for a moment, then set it back in her hand and told her to hold on to it until they did this properly. They married again 6 weeks later in the apartment with no press and no investors. The guest list was the people who had stood beside them when doing so offered nothing in return. Leah carried the rings in a small box she had decorated with drawings, the sun, the dog, the three of them in front of a building, and she approached the job with the focused pride of someone who understood its full importance. In the months that followed, the apartment changed the way spaces change when they are actually lived in. Photographs appeared on walls that had been bare for years. Audrey ran the company with the same precision she always had. Dorian built a placement program for veterans raising children alone, connecting them with employers, legal resources, and the practical support most programs forgot to include. He built it quietly, without announcement, and it found its footing the same way he had one careful choice at a time. Leah never called Audrey by any name other than her name. Audrey never asked her to. She understood, in the way she had come to understand most things that mattered, that a family is not assembled through the right words or the right paperwork or the performance of the correct gestures at the correct moments. It is built from the accumulated weight of ordinary choices, the dinners, the drawings on the refrigerator, the evenings spent waiting for someone to come through the door, made by people who have decided without guarantees or contracts that those choices are worth making. The lie that started everything was 3 words long and lasted roughly 40 seconds in a restaurant. What replaced it had no expiration date. It just required them to keep choosing it. And as it turned out, that was the easiest part. Some stories remind you that the most important moments don't announce themselves. They just ask you to show up. If this one stayed with you, share it with someone who needs to hear it today. And if you're new here, we put out stories like this one every week. Subscribe and we'll see you in the next one.